A lantern flickered above her like a trembling, artificial star, casting erratic shadows across the canvas ceiling of the American Field Hospital. The world around her pulsed with noises she couldn't name. Metal trays clattering, boots thudding against wooden planks, the hiss of some unfamiliar machine. And beneath all of it, the distant, bone-deep thrum of artillery still thundering somewhere beyond Aachen's shattered outskirts. She tried to lift her head, but the motion sent a bolt of dizziness washing through her, and when she finally managed it, her eyes found the thing she feared most. Her own lower leg wrapped in thick, blood-stained dressings, lying stiff and completely foreign on the stretcher, as if it belonged to someone else. She willed her toes to move. Nothing happened, not even the ghost of a twitch. Her breath caught in her throat, and her voice emerged in a cracked whisper before spilling into a trembling plea. Ich kann mein Bein nicht fühlen. The words felt too large in her mouth, as if naming the fear made it heavier. The medics bustling around her didn't seem to hear, or perhaps they didn't understand. They spoke in rapid English, a blur of clipped syllables and urgent commands that felt like wind blowing past her ears. One of them pointed at her chart, another adjusted the splint, and a third leaned over her with a stethoscope, nodding with exhaustion rather than reassurance. The young woman, just 22, a Luftwaffe signals auxiliary drafted into uniform as the German front fractured, couldn't remember how she had been brought here. Only flashes returned to her. The cramped bunker lit by dying radio tubes, the coded messages she transcribed with fingers numb from cold, the shell impact that tore open the earth and hurled her sideways, and the sudden, sickening warmth spreading across her leg. She remembered the medic's grim face as he wrapped it poorly and muttered that legs like this don't get saved anymore. She remembered his retreating footsteps as the line collapsed, and she was left half-conscious among splintered equipment and the dust of pulverized stone. Now she was here, among Americans. Men she had been told since childhood were crude, violent, and indifferent to suffering, especially the suffering of Germans. Propaganda instructors had shown them caricatures of American soldiers with oversized fists and empty eyes, insisting that capture would mean degradation, starvation, and humiliation. Yet as she lay on the stretcher, the scent of sterile gauze drifting toward her, the scene didn't match the warnings. No one jeered at her. No one struck her. No one seemed eager to finish what the shell had started. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of order, strained, frantic, but undeniably purposeful, as if every person here, regardless of nationality, had been pulled into the same desperate rhythm of trying to keep bodies alive. A tall American doctor pushed through the crowd, his face drawn tight with fatigue. His uniform tunic hung open, his sleeves rolled high, and sweat beaded along the edges of the mask, dangling from his neck. He carried himself with the weary authority of someone who had seen more wounded than sleep for several days. He lifted her chart, his brow furrowing as he read the notes hastily scribbled by the medics who'd carried her in. His gaze moved from the chart to her face, then down to the ruin beneath the bandages. She braced instinctively, expecting disdain or indifference. Instead, he sighed, a deep, human sound, not unfriendly, and murmured something to the nearest nurse. The nurse called out for an interpreter. Within seconds, a German-American soldier stepped forward. He was young, perhaps not much older than she was, with a wary kindness in his eyes. When he knelt beside her and spoke in her language, smoothly, fluently, her throat tightened with confusion. America, she had been told, was a land of merciless strangers. Yet this man spoke German as if he had grown up next door. He needs to ask you something, the interpreter said softly. Can you feel your foot? She tried again, straining every nerve to send a signal down the length of her leg. The void answered her. No, she whispered. Nothing. The surgeon nodded grimly when the interpreter relayed the answer. He lifted her blanket, examined the limb closely without seeming disturbed by its condition, then gestured for a sterile pin. She bit down hard as he began testing for sensation, watching his eyes rather than the needle. Each time he waited, no reaction came. The numbness felt like an open doorway leading into darkness. A darkness she feared would soon claim the leg entirely. After several silent seconds, the surgeon stepped back and folded his arms. His voice lowered, the tone carrying both calculation and resolve. The interpreter translated slowly, watching her face. He says the damage is severe. Infection is possible, but the arteries may be intact. He believes the leg can be saved. She blinked, stunned. Saved? That word shouldn't have existed in this place. Not for her. She glanced between the surgeon and the interpreter, unsure whether she had misheard. "Why?" she asked, barely audible. "Why would he do that for me?" The interpreter hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because the rules say we must treat prisoners the same as our own. And because he wants to." Before she could respond, the surgeon issued a set of brisk orders. Nurses hurried to prepare penicillin, a substance she had only heard rumors about, spoken of as if it were a miracle reserved for the Allied armies. Another medic began cleaning around the bandages, while a third adjusted the splint so her leg remained elevated. She watched them with disbelief as the surgeon leaned closer and said one more sentence, which the interpreter translated with a faint smile. "We'll fight to keep it. But you must fight too." Her breath trembled in her chest. Something inside her shifted, something small but unmistakable. A crack in the image she had been raised to believe. A fissure in the wall, separating us from them. The surgeon lifted the anesthesia mask, holding it over her face. The smell was sharp, chemical, growing heavier with each breath. Her vision blurred, the lantern above her dissolving into streaks of gold. She felt the interpreter's hand gently squeeze her shoulder, a gesture so simple and yet so foreign that her eyes briefly filled with tears. Just before the darkness swallowed her, she heard the interpreter translate the surgeon's final words. "If we're lucky, she'll feel her toes again." Her last conscious thought clung to that possibility. Not the certainty of loss, but the fragile, unfamiliar promise that her leg might live. And as the world faded, a question lingered in the air like an unanswered prayer. What kind of enemy fights to save what another army was ready to throw away? The first sound that reached her was not a voice, but a rhythm, steady, relentless, and unmistakably human. Stretchers thudded against wooden floors. Scalpels clinked into metal trays. Somewhere nearby, a man groaned through clenched teeth, followed by the brisk command for more morphine. The world inside the American field hospital was a battleground of its own, one where exhaustion and urgency fought louder than any ideology. When she opened her eyes, the lantern light seemed brighter than before, and the atmosphere pulsed with the raw intensity of life being lost and reclaimed in alternating breaths. Snow filtered through gaps in the canvas walls, melting instantly against the heat radiating from bodies, lamps, and boiling water. The air carried a thick blend of disinfectant, sweat, burned fabric, and cold December air, a landscape that felt both distant from the front and unmistakably shaped by it. A stretcher rushed past her, occupying a pair of frantic medics, bearing a young American soldier with shrapnel embedded deep in his side. His blood left a trail on the planks, thin but vibrant, and she wondered how many such trails crossed this makeshift sanctuary each night. Men shouted numbers, pulse rates, blood pressures, triage codes. The system was not pretty nor polite, but it was astonishingly organized. Even from her cot in the recovery ward, she sensed the invisible choreography guiding it all, an unspoken pact to keep chaos outside the tense boundaries. That structure alone startled her more than the language barrier, or had taught her to expect indifference in places like this. What she found was discipline. The surgeon from Iowa, whom she had seen only briefly before slipping into anesthesia, now stood at a central table reviewing charts with the same intensity a commander might use to study battlefield maps. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows, revealing forearms smudged with iodine and dried blood, his own private insignia of the wounded he had carried through the night. He listened to his staff with narrowed eyes, occasionally rubbing the bridge of his nose when a particularly difficult case approached. Yet even in fatigue, he moved with purpose. He knew exactly how to divide his time, which patient required immediate intervention, who needed stabilizing, who might survive long enough to reach a rear hospital. Survival here was mathematics blended with intuition, and he solved each equation as if the war itself depended on it. Her own presence in this place still felt inexplicable. She watched as the interpreter approached the doctor again, handing him an update about her condition. The doctor nodded, pressing his fingers against the pulse in his own temple as if counting through the details. She could not hear what they said, but the interpreter's expression softened before he walked toward her. "They cleaned your wound again," he explained gently in German. "The swelling has gone down a little. That's good. The doctor wants to test sensation again soon." She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or afraid. The war outside moved in brutal certainties. A city captured, a regiment lost, a line broken. But inside this tent, certainties dissolved. Was her leg healing? Would she keep it? Would infection creep in despite the penicillin they gave so sparingly? She felt suspended between outcomes, her future hanging on decisions made by people who should have despised her, but confusingly did not. Across the ward, the surgeon confronted a supply officer whose arms were crossed so tightly his knuckles whitened. Even without understanding the words, she sensed the tension. The interpreter murmured translations, the surgeon demanding more penicillin, the supply officer insisting stocks were dangerously low. There was talk of priority, fairness, and what counted as necessity. The officer gestured sharply toward the American wounded, then toward her side of the ward, where German POWs lay in matching blankets. The implications were unmistakable. She braced herself, expecting the verdict she'd always been warned of, that she was expendable. Instead, the surgeon's voice rose, not angry, but resolute. The interpreter leaned closer, whispering as the doctor spoke. He says the Geneva Convention requires equal treatment. If the Americans abandon that standard, the Germans may feel justified doing the same to American prisoners. A pause. He also says saving a limb is not a luxury. It is medicine. The supply officer exhaled, defeated or perhaps convinced, and marked a note on his clipboard. The argument ended with a reluctant agreement. Her next dose of penicillin would be delivered by evening. She lay stunned, absorbing the weight of that decision. This was not a gesture born of sympathy. It was something steadier, structured, an ethical code enforced even under fire. And though she did not yet trust it, she couldn't deny its effect. She was alive, and they intended to keep her that way. The ward around her became its own strange mosaic of shared suffering. American soldiers with bandaged ribs nodded at German prisoners, missing fingers or limping on crutches. A nurse adjusted blankets on both without hesitation, her expression the same for each. War redrew boundaries violently out on the front, yet inside this tent those boundaries blurred into something simpler, wounded humans clinging to warmth. When the surgeon finally reached her cot, he looked older than she remembered, as if the night had carved new lines along his eyes. He lifted her chart, tapping it with a gloved finger while the interpreter translated. "We will test your foot again tomorrow. If sensation improves, we proceed with recovery. If it does not," he trailed off, leaving the unfinished sentence hovering like steam in the cold air. He didn't need to finish for her to understand. But then his voice sharpened with something that felt almost encouraging. "You are young," he said through the interpreter. "Your body wants to heal. We will give it the tools. But you must endure the process." She nodded, though uncertainty rippled through her. Endurance was familiar. Hope was not. Outside, the howl of distant artillery briefly shook the tent. Snow filtered in again, this time caught in a ray of lamplight, swirling like ash. The war pressed closer every hour, threatening to swallow this fragile pocket of humanity. The surgeon turned to leave, but stopped halfway, glancing back at her with a small, unreadable look. The interpreter hesitated before translating the final sentence. He says, "Feeling may return suddenly. Sometimes, without warning." She stared at her numb foot, its stillness nearly unbearable. Suddenly, without warning, the possibility stirred something she hadn't dared acknowledge. Not belief, but anticipation. A fragile, trembling anticipation that made her breath catch in her throat. And as the surgeon disappeared into the rattle of stretchers and shouted orders, she wondered, just for a heartbeat, what would happen if the next morning brought the first spark of pain where there had been only silence. Dawn crept into the recovery ward, not with sunlight. The canvas walls smothered most of that, but with sound. A kettle rattling over a portable stove. Boots brushing against straw mats. A nurse humming faintly as she checked 4 bottles suspended from improvised wooden frames. And beneath it all, the slow, rhythmic breathing of dozens of injured men, Americans and Germans, sharing the same stale air and the same uneasy truce carved by necessity. When she opened her eyes, her first instinct was to look at her foot. It lay where it always did, wrapped tightly, elevated just enough to dull the swelling. But something was different. Not sensation. Not yet. But a strange awareness, as though her leg existed again in a way it hadn't since the explosion. She swallowed hard, afraid to name the feeling. The interpreter noticed her stirring and stepped closer with an awkward smile, holding a tin cup of warm water. He had become a fixture of her days without either of them deciding it. He translated medical instructions, reassured her when the doctor was too exhausted to soften his tone, and even explained American jokes she didn't understand. When he asked how she felt, She hesitated, unsure whether to voice the faint flicker of hope. "It feels present," she finally managed. "Not alive, but present." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's something," he said, as though marking the words into her chart with invisible ink. Soon the surgeon arrived, carrying the same steady seriousness that seemed stitched into his uniform. His fatigue was evident, bruised half-moons beneath his eyes, a tremor in his fingers when he exhaled, but his focus sharpened when he reached her cot. Through the interpreter, he explained the morning's plan, another test, another measure of what the night had changed. She braced herself. The pin gleamed faintly as he held it up, its sharp edge catching the lantern light like a sliver of winter sun. The moment he knelt beside her, the ward seemed to fade, leaving only the three of them suspended in a small, fragile hope. He pricked the tip of her toe. Nothing. He pressed a little harder. Still nothing. She closed her eyes, fighting the sinking wave of disappointment. But then he shifted the pin slightly, touching the edge of her foot, and a faint warmth stirred deep in the numbness. So faint she questioned it. "Again," she whispered. He complied. This time, something flickered, an echo of sensation, like the memory of pain rather than pain itself. Her breath hitched, too soft for anyone else to hear, but the surgeon noticed her expression shift. He remained silent, pricking once more, slightly higher this time. A sharp spark shot through her, fast and thin as lightning. She gasped and jerked her leg instinctively. It was the smallest movement, but undeniable. The interpreter grinned before he could stop himself. "You felt that," he said. She nodded, stunned. Her heart pounded against her ribs, wild and disbelieving. The surgeon allowed himself the faintest smile, an expression that transformed his weary face into something momentarily younger. He spoke softly, and the interpreter translated, "This is good. Very good. The nerves are waking." She let out a trembling breath she didn't know she'd been holding. But recovery, she soon learned, was its own brutal kind of battle. The moment sensation returned, pain followed, slowly at first, then blooming with relentless persistence. Her leg throbbed as blood flow improved, each pulse a reminder of wounded flesh struggling to knit itself back together. The nurses changed her dressings with practiced gentleness, but even their lightest touch made her gasp. Strangely, she welcomed the agony. Pain meant survival. Pain meant the limb still belonged to her. Outside, winter tightened its grip. Snow drifted past the cracks in the tent, carried by winds sharp enough to rattle the metal poles. The distant artillery fire became less frequent. Rumors whispered that the Germans were preparing a desperate counteroffensive, though no one knew when or where. Inside the ward, however, the war felt muted, replaced by a rhythm of recovery, infection checks, and improvisational humanity. She watched American soldiers share cigarettes with German prisoners, trading gestures and broken words instead of bullets. One evening, a young American joked, through the interpreter, that the German prisoners were getting better soup than his unit ever did. Laughter rolled lightly across the ward, dissolving tension for a single moment. Her own perspective shifted with every passing day. The surgeon's dedication unsettled her the most. He never treated her differently from the Americans, never spoke down to her, never reminded her she was the enemy. Instead, he moved through the ward with the quiet conviction that saving lives, not scoring victories, defined his purpose. Watching him work forced her to reconsider the propaganda she had been raised on. The warnings, the caricatures, the insistence that Americans saw Germans as animals to be broken. Nothing in this tent matched those stories. And every contradiction made her uneasy, as if her beliefs were slipping through her fingers like melting snow. One evening, as the ward settled into the uneasy calm that came after dusk, the interpreter sat beside her with a mug of weak cocoa. She asked him how he came to speak German so well. His smile was faint, almost embarrassed. "My parents came from Bremen," he said. "I grew up speaking both languages. When the war began, I joined the army. They needed translators." She studied him quietly. "So you are German," she murmured. He shook his head gently. "No, I am American, but I understand both sides more than most." Her gaze drifted toward her bandaged leg. "Do you think the doctor understands too?" she asked. The interpreter considered the question before answering. "He understands pain," he said simply. "That's enough." As the days passed, the pain in her leg sharpened, shifted, and slowly became manageable. The surgeon tested her sensation again, pricking near the ankle. She winced immediately. The reaction drew approving nods from the nurses. She found herself laughing weakly through tears, astonished that pain could feel like triumph. Yet not all moments brought comfort. Some nights, she lay awake, staring at the tent's ceiling, wondering whether this kindness was temporary, an illusion that would vanish once the war shifted again. She feared that one morning the surgeon might decide the struggle was no longer worth the supplies, or the interpreter might be reassigned, leaving her lost among unintelligible voices. But every dawn brought the same measured routine, the same determined commitment. Then, one morning, as she stretched beneath her blanket, a new sensation shot through her leg, deeper, sharper than any before. It was not the dull ache of healing. It was something far more urgent. She gasped aloud, startling the patient beside her. Her toes had moved, not on command, but unmistakably. Reflex. Life. Before she could fully process the moment, a burst of shouting erupted outside the ward. Voices tense, hurried, cutting sharply through the morning calm. The interpreter rushed toward the entrance, the surgeon following close behind. Something significant had changed beyond the canvas walls, something that threatened to invade the fragile sanctuary where her leg had just begun to live again. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals over the ruins of a small West German town, its white flakes settling gently on broken stone as if trying to heal the landscape one breath at a time. A young woman stepped carefully along the uneven street, her gait steady but marked by a faint stiffness in her lower leg. The scar beneath her winter stocking ached in the cold, an ache she had come to accept, even welcome. Years had passed since the field hospital near Aachen, yet every step she took still carried the echo of that tent, the smell of disinfectant, the murmur of English voices, and the sharp sting of the pin that first pulled her back from numbness. Now, in the uneasy peace of the late 1940s, she walked on a limb once declared lost. And with each measured stride, she felt the weight of a story she had never fully told. Her mind returned often to the day the shouting erupted outside the recovery ward. She had lain half upright, blinking in the sudden clamor, while the surgeon and the interpreter disappeared through the canvas flaps. For a moment, she feared the worst, that the hospital was being moved or shelled or overrun. But the truth was stranger, and in some small, ironic way, more hopeful. The Americans had learned of a looming German offensive, one that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The front was shifting again, and the wounded, the staff, and even the prisoners needed to be secured or relocated. The hospital buzzed with tense urgency, but the surgeon insisted on one final sensation test before transport. She remembered the pin touching the arch of her foot and the shock that ran like fire through her nerves. She cried out, startled not by pain, but by victory. He nodded with fierce satisfaction. "You will keep it," the interpreter translated. "The leg is yours." That sentence became a turning point she carried through every subsequent uncertainty. When the hospital moved rearward, she traveled with the other POWs, confined but safe, receiving continued treatment. She leaned on the clinic's doorway, watching them, when the interpreter's words surfaced again in her memory. "He understands pain." That's enough. She wondered if that kind of understanding could ever bridge the gulf left by the war. Maybe it already had, in small, invisible ways. Maybe the leg that carried her across the broken street was itself a quiet argument against the simplicity of hatred. Each day, she walked a bit farther. The ache sharpened in winter, softened in spring, and deepened whenever rain rolled in from the west. But she welcomed it. Pain anchored her to the truth. She had been given a chance she had never expected, from people she had been taught to fear. That contradiction grew into a private compass she followed silently. When she found work assisting a nurse in the clinic, cleaning tools, boiling linens, organizing herbs and gauze, she realized with a start that she was retracing, in small fragments, the care she had once received. She had not intended to emulate that world, but some experiences leave footprints that never fade. One evening, as she closed the clinic shutters, she noticed a pair of elderly women waiting at the door, one supporting the other. The weaker woman had an infected cut along her leg, swollen and reddened, and she winced with every step. The local doctor was away. Without thinking, the younger former POW guided the women inside, cleaned the wound carefully, applied ointment, wrapped the leg with steady hands that trembled only slightly. When the elderly woman thanked her, tears shining in her tired eyes, something deep within her stirred. A recognition, a remembering. She had been the helpless one once, lying beneath strange lantern light, wondering whether her limb would be claimed by infection or indifference. And now, by some quiet, graceful symmetry, she stood on the other side. Later, she walked home beneath a sky streaked with the muted reds of a fading sunset. When Germany surrendered months later, she found herself among the many thousands processed for repatriation, fingerprinted, documented, returned to a homeland cracked open by ruin. The Americans handed her a small folder containing medical summaries, dosage notes, and an English letter explaining her injury. She kept it tucked beneath her clothing for the entire transport. It was the closest thing she had to proof that compassion had existed even in a place built for war. Now, walking through her damaged town, she watched neighbors rebuild homes with makeshift timber and salvaged bricks. Everyone carried private stories of survival, loss, or compromise. Yet few spoke of the time spent in American custody except in whispers and never with the nuance she held inside her. There was a bitterness that lingered in many hearts, a sense of humiliation braided tightly with hunger and grief. Admitting that the enemy had shown mercy seemed almost disloyal to the suffering that surrounded them. So she kept her memories quiet, folded like the medical card she still hid in a small tin box beneath her bed. One afternoon, she visited the town's provisional clinic, a repurposed schoolroom with thin curtains and worn tables. The doctor, a middle-aged man who had survived the Eastern Front, recognized her limp immediately and asked to examine her. As he checked the alignment of her bones and the flexibility of her ankle, he marveled quietly at the outcome. Many with injuries like yours, he said, did not return with two legs. His tone was neutral, not accusatory, yet she felt something tremble inside her. She wanted to tell him about the surgeon from Iowa, about the interpreter with Bremen roots, about the nurses who tucked blankets around prisoners and offered Jell-O as if it were gold. But she hesitated. The room around her felt too fragile to contain such contradictions. Outside, children played by kicking a dented tin can through the debris. Their laughter echoed strangely against the ruins, a sound both hopeful and haunted. The pain in her leg pulsed with each step, but she no longer feared it. She paused at a street corner overlooking the river, the air cold enough to sting her cheeks. Across the water, new scaffolding rose like ribs of a future city. She traced the scar through her stocking and exhaled slowly. Had the surgeon known what his decision would shape? Would he ever imagine that the leg he saved now supported a life built on the echoes of his kindness? The wind rustled the bare branches overhead as she turned to continue home. Her steps were small, steady, and undeniably her own. But as she reached the next crossroads, she caught sight of something unexpected at the far end of the street. An American relief truck, its tires crunching through fresh snow. And standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was a familiar silhouette. A young man with cautious posture, dark hair, and a face she had last seen framed by canvas and lantern light. The interpreter had returned.